Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. It's Monday, July 21st, 2014. I'm David Knight, and here are our top stories.
Tonight, Border Patrol agents are kept in the dark about recent cartel violence. Then, what you're not being told about Flight MH17. And Verizon makes it trendy to surrender your privacy. That's next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
To make you think, oh, they're trying to stop terrorists. No, they're tracking everything you do to know you better than you know yourself, to be able to give that select corp.
Now, if mainstream media was not functioning in a purely propaganda mode, it would be asking the typical kind of questions that you ask in journalism. Who, what, where, why? Now, we immediately got some implausible answers about who. We were told what it was, and although that was reasonable that it was a Buk missile system, we were not shown any photographs, and we're going to have some stories about that later on. But the real question is, why was the airplane where it was? Now, earlier today on the Alex Jones radio show, he took some calls from airline pilots and air traffic controllers, and they raised these same questions. And we're going to have a report about that at the end of the show. But let's remember that it wasn't just that this flight MH17 was over a Ukrainian war zone. It was also the height that it was told to fly by the Ukrainian air traffic controllers. It requested, after they put it into that airspace, to fly at only 35,000 feet. Then they were told to go lower to 33,000 feet, which was right at the level that the European controllers had warned people not to go below. And of course, the FAA had given hard prohibitions to all American airlines and American pilots. And now we see something even more bizarre in Syria. This also involves a Malaysian airliner. It was diverted over Syrian airspace. Now, on Robert Perry's site, consortiumnews.com, this is the question that he says his source raised to him. He said, the dog not barking question, and that's a Sherlock Holmes analogy, of course, on the catastrophe over the Ukraine is, what did the U.S. surveillance satellite imagery show? It's hard to believe that with the attention of the U.S. intelligence concentrated on eastern Ukraine for the past half year, that the alleged trucking of several large Buk anti-aircraft missile systems from Russia to the Ukraine, then back to Russia, didn't show up somewhere. And he points out that the Buk missiles are about 16 feet long. They're trucked around on large trucks or on top of tanks. And then he asked the question, how can the Washington Post run front page stories like the one it did on Sunday, which gives a definitive title, the U.S. official says that Russia gave these systems. He says, how can they do that without demanding from these same U.S. officials details about what the satellite images, the U.S. satellite images disclose? In other words, they would see these large systems. And if they're making these claims, clearly they have some pictures to back this up. We even got pictures before Iraq or after Iraq when we were being lied to about that. And then he points out this interesting revelation from his source. He says there was also a suggestion from a source that the soldiers involved were undisciplined, possibly drunk, and possibly Ukrainian, since the imagery showed what looked like beer bottles scattered around the site. See, it's so detailed that they can see the beer bottles. Actually, it's probably so detailed with today's satellite imagery, they could tell you what brand of beer they were drinking. But we don't see any pictures of what we're told shot it down or people who did shoot it down. We believe that they would have those images. Reputable sources like the Washington Post are basically putting out the talking points in a propagandistic way, saying that we know this is true, and yet they haven't vetted those sources. We haven't seen the satellite images. We do have some photographic evidence, however, that shows that the Ukraine regime was delivering Buk missiles to troops. Now, this is a story by Kurt Nimmo on today's INFOWARS.com. He says, now listen to this take on it. We have a California Republican and a House Foreign Affairs chairman, Ed Royce, and he's criticizing the Obama administration for not sending weapons to the regime in Kiev. Now, of course, the most vocal neocons are the ones right now who are in the GOP because they're trying to score some cheap political points out of the fact that we haven't escalated this by sending more arms in. And Royce is saying that Russia has sent in tanks, rocket launchers, other military equipment to the separatists, although, of course, he did not provide evidence of the transfer. Well, we do know that the Ukrainian government has Buk missiles. Now, as we pointed out last Thursday when this first happened, this is a picture from July 4th, 2014, which shows Buk missile launchers being transferred by Ukrainian government forces. So yes, they both had it, and the fact that these are made by Russia doesn't really say anything one way or the other, because most of the weapons there that the Ukraine has, as well as the separatists, are Russian-made. And of course, it was a Russian-made missile that shot down a Russian commercial airliner back in 2001. Now, just so that you know that we're in full-out war hysteria mode, we now see people like Ron Paul and other people who are dissenting from this line of attack, dissenting from jumping ahead full steam into a war hysteria. We see them demonized as dissenters, and this is a story from the National Journal. Ron Paul is Putin's new best friend. They say it used to be that blaming America for crises abroad was largely the province of liberals. But now we have Ron Paul, who has been quick to attack the West and President Obama for pointing any fingers in the direction of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Says just days after the tragic crash of Malaysian Airlines flight over eastern Ukraine, Western politicians and media joined together to gain the maximum propaganda value for the disaster. That's what Ron Paul said. He said it had to be Russia. It had to be Putin, they said. Now, she doesn't, this is the writer is Lucia Graves. She doesn't give any of the information that Ron Paul said as to why he believes this is a false narrative, why they're pushing that, why it's propaganda. But we carried the story on INFOWARS.com. We carried Ron Paul's full article, and he has some very good reasons. Now, this is what Ron Paul actually said. He said, just days after the tragic crash of a Malaysian airliner flight over eastern Ukraine, Western politicians and media joined together to gain the maximum propaganda value from the disaster. He says Obama's ambassador to the UN, Samantha Powers, at the UN Security Council, announced who was responsible just one day after the crash. But he says these are the things they will not report. And he goes on to list several things that you're not hearing from the media. He says without U.S.-sponsored regime change, it's unlikely that hundreds would have been killed in the unrest that follows, and of course the Malaysian airline crash would have never happened. He also says they'll not report that the Ukrainian government also uses the exact same Russian-made weapons, which is what we just pointed out in our story. He says they will not report that the post-coup government in Kiev has killed 250 people in the breakaway region since June, including 20 that have been killed after the plane crash. He says they won't report that neither Russia nor separatists in the eastern Ukraine have anything to gain, but everything to lose by shooting down a passenger liner full of civilians. And they won't report that the Ukrainian government has much to gain by pinning the attack on Russia. And finally, he says, and they will not point out the similarities to what happened a year ago in Syria with the sarin gas attack. And of course, we have pointed out that, as well as the lack of motivation, many times. Now, also last Thursday, even though it hasn't been as heavily covered, something else very major happened. And of course, that was Israel's invasion of Gaza. Now, listen to Obama's statement made last Thursday. Listen to how rich in irony and hypocrisy it is.
We discussed Israel's military operation in Gaza, including its efforts to stop the threat of terrorist infiltration through tunnels into Israel. I reaffirmed my strong support for Israel's right to defend itself. No nation should accept rockets being fired into its borders or terrorists tunneling into its territory.
Now, let me just repeat what he said. He said, of course, he reaffirmed his strong support for Israel's right to defend itself. In other words, by defending its borders. And he went on to say, no nation should accept rockets being fired into its borders or terrorists tunneling into its territory. Well, how does he explain what's happening on the U.S. border? Why do we have to give up our right to self-defense? Why do we have to allow people to tunnel or even just walk across our borders? And of course, it's not just unaccompanied children. These are very dangerous gang members, and of course, any terrorist could come across the border. But he said on Wall Street Journal yesterday, titled, "Tunnels Matter More Than Rockets to Hamas," they said early in the current clash between Hamas and Israel, much of the drama was in the air, in other words, about the rockets, but the real story has been underground. Hamas's tunnels into Israel are potentially much more dangerous than its random rocket barrages. And they say this indicates that Hamas's tunnels and not the well-publicized episodes of kidnapping and murder are what they're really concerned about. Now, the question is, of course, we have questions as to whether or not these unaccompanied children that are being brought here are being kidnapped. But we also know that very dangerous drug gangs, multinational drug gangs, are free to come across, even using distractions of unaccompanied children to massively move across the border and to move their equipment and other things across the border. We also have this report from a whistleblower who talked directly to Adon Salazar. He said cartel gunfire forces border agents to run for cover, kind of like firing missiles across a border, isn't it? Customs and Border Protection has yet to brief its agents on the circumstances surrounding a shooting that occurred last week in South Texas, in which federal agents dodged heavy military-grade fire from the Mexican side of the border. An agent has confirmed to INFOWARS, an exclusive story. He said the shooting last night is going unreported in our agency and in the media. He said shots were not directed at border agents. Rather, he didn't say that, but the Border Patrol spokesperson said that. However, the local CBS News affiliate doesn't believe that. They have a report from Congressman Louis Gohmert, who was in the area, and he was saying that they were being shot at with 50 caliber bullets. He said bullets ricocheted into an area where Border Patrol agents were positioned. We don't have any armor that can stop a 50 caliber round, so our Border Patrol agents had to take cover when the rounds were ricocheting around them. And that's what Representative Gohmert told Fox News. So let's be clear. We're not asking Obama to defend our borders by firing missiles into Mexico. We're not asking him to invade Mexico. We're just asking him to stop incentivizing an invasion into our country. But of course, they're doing just the opposite. Here's another exclusive report from Adon Salazar and a source with the Border Patrol agency. He says that they're being ordered to release pregnant illegals. South Texas Customs and Border Protection agents have been ordered to release pregnant illegal immigrants, as well as those who merely claim to be pregnant. This is what the agent told INFOWARS. And this, of course, is with any stage of pregnancy. He sent an email and said, "At my muster yesterday, we received orders to begin releasing all pregnant female illegal aliens in the Rio Grande Valley sector. Any stage of pregnancy, whether 2 weeks or 8 months. We do not have a method of testing for an actual pregnancy either, so it appears that we'll just have to take their word for it." So is the Obama administration suddenly turning pro-life? Are they recognizing these as anchor fetuses? You know, we've had anchor babies. Now we move back to what they would call anchor fetuses, because before the child is born, they call them fetus, which is just Latin for baby anyway. But we've also got anchor teens coming in. And the question is, are those teens really unaccompanied minors, or are they helping to traffic, or are they part of a gang members? Nevertheless, it's the policies that are inviting them in. We have open borders. We're not controlling the borders. And unlike Israel, we're not worried about terrorists crossing the borders, but we are worried about them coming in through airports still, of course. Now, this is from the Human Rights Watch and Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute. Now, this is something, of course, that we've told you many times. We've documented it. So has Judge Andrew Napolitano. What they're saying is, in a 214-page report looking at 27 federal terrorism cases, they say Americans have been told that their government is keeping them safe by preventing and prosecuting terrorism inside the U.S. But if you take a closer look, you realize that many of these people would never have committed a crime if not for law enforcement encouraging, pressuring, sometimes paying them to commit terrorist acts. Now, they focus on the aspect that this is singling out unfairly Muslims, but of course, we are all suffering under the police state that has been created and, of course, justified by these false flag events that are constantly being created and run and organized by the FBI. You know what is happening at the border is exactly the same thing, only on a national scale. Now, we also see, of course, that this is something that's been going on for quite a long time abroad. We see that ISIS domestic terror threat created by the CIA and the U.S. military. This is an article by Kurt Nimmo that came out this weekend. Of course, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are being run and created and enabled by the CIA, just like the FBI runs these terrorist events here in the United States and then shuts them down to justify their existence. The article points out the problem, as they're told by U.S. counterterrorism and intelligence officials, is that there are just so many jihadists with Western passports traveling to fight in Syria that they worry that some of them may slip back into the U.S. without being detected. Why are we worried about that? They can just walk across our wide open borders. Why do they need to come through